Hello and welcome in the new episode of Top Talk. My name is Rusif Husseinov, and today my guest is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, and the founder and editor of the EA Worldview, a leading website in daily news and analysis of the Middle East. Professor Lucas, thanks for finding time for this interview.
Rusif, thank you, and thanks for all of your viewers for inviting me here.
Thank you, Professor. Today, we talk about Iran's foreign policy, or more precisely, about Iranian policies on South Caucasus, a tiny and uneasy region to the north of Iran. Professor Lucas, South Caucasus has been frequently making headlines in the past 2 years due to the Karabakh War, Armenia-Azerbaijan process, the internal happenings in Georgia, Azerbaijan-Iran tensions, etc. But how would you characterize this region for Iran's foreign policy and/or statecraft? Or what is the position of South Caucasus in Tehran's hierarchy of priority regions?
I think the South Caucasus is very important for the Iranian leadership, but it is important as a wheel within a wheel in terms of a number of relationships. So perhaps I should explain. Clearly, Iran would have direct interest with its neighbors, including Azerbaijan, including Armenia. You could think about interests, for example, that have been discussed in recent months, such as the question of transit corridors. You could think about energy projects, such as, for example, the dam built on the Iran-Azerbaijani border that was being inaugurated just before the death of Iran's President Raisi in the helicopter crash. You could talk about the economic links that are there between those areas. You could talk about energy links that are all in play there. But the issue of a wheel within a wheel, well, first of all, you have to put that relationship that Iran has with its neighbors within that of the relationships between the neighbors. And if we talk about Armenia and Azerbaijan, we have to talk about a state of ongoing tension, clearly in part about Nagorno-Karabakh, about the Azerbaijani enclave within Armenia, but also about other issues between the two countries. So, that makes it a question of that Iran at times is trying to balance between Armenia and Azerbaijan as it's pursuing its policy that's there. If you get too close to one, do you antagonize the other? But then let's talk about the wider wheels. There are other countries who have interest in the South Caucasus. Let's talk about Russia, for example. And when Iran is talking about its relationships with Azerbaijan, then the question is, well, where's Russia in this? Russia, of course, has its own interest in shifting position vis-a-vis Azerbaijan, vis-a-vis Armenia, but that's a relationship which is now complicated by Russian commitments elsewhere, notably its invasion of Ukraine. So that means that Iran's own relationship with Russia is one which might be closer on the military front. Think about Iran sending all those attack drones to Russia that it uses in Ukraine. But then it also makes the relationship between Iran and Russia a bit tense on the economic front. Each of them would like to get economic links in the South Caucasus. Each of them would like to have this, they would be the leading force in those links, the leading power in those links. And that, of course, is not going to be possible. You can't have, Russia and Iran each being the most influential power, which takes place there. So you have that uneasy tension which takes place. Then you have the interest of other countries economically, which may cut across the South Caucasus. Think because of energy interests such as Turkey, and where this plays into Iran's relations with Turkey, for example, which may be affected by the South Caucasus. Think about China with that whole question of the Belt and Road Initiative at a time when Iran is having to think, all right, where's our own relationship with Beijing? But to give you the broadest framework, Iran, for many years, and especially in the last few years, is increasingly isolated economically and politically. And I'm not just talking about the US-led sanctions. Iran has very difficult relationships with many European states, not just because of the nuclear program, but because of Iran's regional activities, because of Iran's crackdown on its population at home. So Iran has to look elsewhere for relationships. Now, it will look to China, it will look to Russia, it will look to the South Caucasus, it will even look, say, to Latin America. But each of those countries has its own issues that will complicate those relationships. So, to give you the broadest example that you might know about, if you look out from Azerbaijan, I'll give you two broad examples. If you were to look at, for example, what CTSO, the notion of a security organization encompassing all these countries, that is a very unstable group of countries. There's no Russia stable leadership of that, because if you look, Armenia is unsettled with where Russia is going. Azerbaijan has its own issues with where Russia is going. Kazakhstan has its own issues with where Russia is going. So this is not like an alliance in which Iran can work with a bloc. Or to give you the broadest example, you'll see references in the media to BRICS. Brazil, Russia, Iran, China, South Africa, they can organize the world. Those countries can't even agree with each other. India and China have a very tense relationship at the moment, with India very concerned that there might be a Chinese military buildup on its borders. The South Africans are keeping their distance from Russia. And arguably South Africa's main interest right now internationally is it's in the lead on the Israel issue with its case before the International Criminal Court. So I guess the way I think of international relations quite often is it's a kaleidoscope. It's always turning. The pieces are always turning. So Iran will always have interest in the South Caucasus, but to say that this is a firm, stable relationship is not possible, because the pieces around, say, Iran's relations with Azerbaijan keep turning. To give you another example, simply because of where we are in Israel and Gaza after Hamas's initial attacks inside Israel, and then the Israeli war on Gaza, which is now in its 8th month.
Well, Professor, this is a very interesting and comprehensive introduction. Thank you for that. You spoke about Iran's relationship with other stakeholders in the region. We'll come back to this issue a little bit later, but I would kindly ask you now to analyze Tehran's relations with 3 South Caucasus nations. Let's start with Azerbaijan first, which is Iran's northern neighbor, a nominally Shia society, and I'm sure many of our followers are already knowledgeable about this. So one can think that these two countries should be or could be natural allies, but this is not the case. In fact, the Azerbaijan-Iran relations are usually marked by tensions. How do these tensions look from Western Europe, where you are currently living and working?
I mean, the first is, and I must be honest with your viewers, there's I think, except for very, very niche communities who have a specific focus on the South Caucasus, you would hear very little about Azerbaijan in Western Europe. Now, you'll hear about Iran on a daily basis because of the nature of the Iran-US relationship, the Iran-Israel relationship. But for most people in Western Europe, I dare say the only time they might have heard of Azerbaijan in recent years would be because of Nagorno-Karabakh. And they'll only hear of that issue at a point when, of course, we actually have a position of not just conflict, but open violence in Nagorno-Karabakh, as was the case, going back several months. When that doesn't happen, then maybe a few people in Western Europe might know that Azerbaijan is important because of energy transit. Might know that, right? I think other parts of Europe, as you move further to the east, and we'll talk about some of those countries perhaps, are going to be more cognizant of Azerbaijan, right? And clearly, of course, Turkey, with its interest in the BTC pipeline, is going to be very conscious of what happens in Azerbaijan. But I have to say, Azerbaijan is in this space where all of these issues that are very concerning to you and to your viewers, they would be very, very distant in Western Europe. So what I think you have to do is you have to bring it down to really the question of, all right, where could the headlines, which are often concerned with Iran, then wind up in being headlines about Azerbaijan getting into Western Europe and affecting what Western Europe sees. And I think at the moment that Azerbaijani-Iranian relationship, which, as you've already noted, is very, very complex, because it's not a clearly defined relationship one way or the other, close allies, close enemies, people probably don't pay that much attention to it. That said, let me pick up on that Iranian-Azerbaijani relationship you talk about with this opening point for you. That is, if we're to talk about the Iranian leadership, I think a lot of people start with the assumption of, oh, it's a Shia theocracy, which it is. So therefore, its relationships will be with Shia communities. Now, it doesn't really work that way. Think about, for example, the fact that perhaps that while Iran, for example, would have a close relationship with the Shia in Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran also, of course, has tried to cultivate a close relationship with Sunni Muslims in Hamas. And the calculation here is not necessarily one that starts with religion. It's, of course, starts with the region and with working with groups who are challengers to Israel, right? Think about that in the past 18 months. There's been not a reconciliation, but at least a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Having broken relations for 7 years, now Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia are now have a working relationship. So when Iran looks at Azerbaijan, quite often, it's not in the question of, all right, we have Shia communities. It's the question of, are we dealing with a country who is an ally or a rival?
Yeah.
And I think if you were to drill
Yeah.
down, if you were to talk about West and East Azerbaijan, right, the primary issue for
Yeah.
Iran's security apparatus is not we are dealing with, for example, Shia communities in this part of the world. It's a question of we're dealing with communities who quite often, because of their local concerns or because of broader concerns, and here the question, of course, of women's rights comes into play in recent years, they would see that Azeri population as being troublesome. And if they see that population as being troublesome, on occasion, what they've done is they blamed Azerbaijan for that. Now, that blame has diminished in recent months for reasons we could talk about, because there's always a contest between the pragmatism, which is the economic links, the transit links, the energy links, versus the Iranian leadership's concern with internal stability. And those two don't necessarily work in the same direction.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's interesting. Professor, what about the other two countries in South Caucasus? Right now, both Armenia and Georgia are pretty much preoccupied by their own domestic cataclysms. But to what extent do you feel Iran's role or influence in these two countries?
I think the Iranians have got a real problem with Armenia right now, which is not directly because of Iran and Armenia, it's because of Ukraine. What has happened is that Vladimir Putin's gamble, and it's a gamble that, by the way, I think he's losing for reasons we can talk about in another interview, but his gamble on invading Ukraine in 2022 has set off a whole chain of effects. Because he could not get a quick victory in Ukraine, it put a strain on Russia's relationships with other countries, so-called security relationships. Now, it just so happened that one of those countries is Armenia. That strain on the Russian relationship with Armenia was exacerbated because the Armenians believe they were betrayed by the Russians over Nagorno-Karabakh. Their perception was that Russia was coming in to maintain stability over Nagorno-Karabakh, but there would be no change in the status of the area. That has not proven to be true, and there's a lot of blame for the Russians for that. For that reason, Armenia is not looking back to Russia necessarily for support, and they're not necessarily looking back to Iran for support. They're looking across Europe for support, right? Now, we're not talking about a situation where Armenia all of a sudden joins the European Union or something like that, but we're talking about a buildup of links with other countries in Europe as a possible, as it were, diversifying of their relationships. And the Iranians are so preoccupied with other challenges because right now, of course, they're preoccupied with what's happening in the Middle East, including Israel, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, that they cannot go in and, as it were, really repair that Armenian relationship. And of course, if they did try to repair their relationship with Armenia, it might also unsettle their relationship with Azerbaijan because it might upset the balance between the two countries. So Iran would still like to have influence in Armenia, but I think that's a receding at the moment. Georgia, I think that's even more the case. And I think that, again, Georgia is one step removed beyond Ukraine when it comes to Russia, because it does not have the border with Russia. Yet the Ukraine invasion has elevated the domestic contest and the domestic challenges in Georgia. As we have seen over the recent protests, the mass protests sparked by the Foreign Agents Law, Georgia is in a position right now where you have a president and a ruling party who are opposed to each other. You have a ruling party whose hold on parliament is being challenged as illegitimate by at least some of the population. At the same time, the Georgian population does not want to have open internal civil war. You don't want to benefit from that. So Georgia's domestic position, as well as its attempt to balance itself between Russia and between the rest of Europe, that again means it's preoccupied. That's its priority rather than the question of where its relationship is with Iran.
Professor, earlier you spoke about the external powers or stakeholders vis-a-vis South Caucasus, and we know that the activities of these external actors, they're not limited to Russia and Turkey in this case, because in our South Caucasus context we have such traditional actors as the US or the EU, and we see also the growing influence of non-traditional actors such as China and India. There is also Israel here. So what is the modus operandi for Iran in this geopolitical setting? Can you see some room for Tehran's regime?
Well, I mean, in terms of where we are with Azerbaijan, I think if you were to game this out, you want to draw closer to Azerbaijan in part to push the Israelis back. Because, if you have a buildup of links which are Iran focused, then Israel's own attempt to get economic influence in terms of the technological sectors, that tends to be curbed. To be honest with you, I think Israel is going to be curbed anyway, because we talked about Vladimir Putin's gamble earlier, Benjamin Netanyahu's gamble, which is it did follow Hamas's mass killings, but his own gamble, which is to wage an all-out war in Gaza, is not going well at the least. And I think the divisions within Israeli society, the economic consequences of the war, in a sense, are going to curb Israel. It won't remove Israel. You know very well that it has various networks in Azerbaijan, but I think the Israelis, in a sense, are sidelined for a moment because of Gaza. The Americans as well. We have this image of America being involved everywhere. I've written about it for decades. And America does have interest across the world. It's the nature of it. But right now, America has got so many immediate cases that it has to deal with, which is it's having to deal with, let's think about it, the consequences of Israel-Gaza, its own tension with Iran, the question of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the issue of China, which is a big issue in the US domestically, that the South Caucasus, I think, is a position where the American interest right now would simply be everybody just stay calm. I don't think that image of the Americans coming in to stir it up and to gain influence is one that plays out here. And by the way, I'd say, since we just talked about Georgia, Georgians who are quite sensitive to external interference would think, are the Americans trying to stir up protests there? I don't think the Americans are. That's a local issue, which is where you have those protests come out. But in terms of Azerbaijan, the issue here is that if relations stabilized across the Middle East, if they stabilized in other areas, and importantly, if the relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan, if the tensions decrease, that plays out to the benefit of the Americans, and I think it also plays out to the benefit of the Chinese. This is one case where I think those powers actually probably would find common ground, which is we just don't want any breakout of violence in this area. Because the other factor I mentioned to you is, of course, energy markets don't like instability. Energy markets don't like wars. It's bad. It raises the price of oil. I know that and so on, but in the long term, it's destabilizing to the energy industry. And so I think at this point, when we're talking about external stakeholders, I think Azerbaijan's immediate neighbors have got immediate issues to deal with there. I think the powers who are further removed are not going to be upfront in what they're doing in Azerbaijan. They'll just want everything to settle down.
Well, that was very interesting, Professor Lucas. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all your listeners. And I look forward to all your ideas because I learn from you, especially when it comes to this very important country that so many of us in Western Europe don't pay attention to, this country of Azerbaijan.